For the first time in about a month, the NASCAR Cup Series is going back to a 1.5 mile track this weekend in Kentucky. They've been at these big, flat, fast tracks for the past 2 weekends, and a different type of driver is going to contend there than what we should expect for this weekend. It requires kind of us to reset our brains, go back to the Homestead race back in the middle of June, and try to remember who was fast in those races. The good thing is we don't have to care as much about where drivers start as we have for the past couple of weeks, and that is definitely a relief and something we should focus on heavily for this weekend. We have more freedom with DFS lineups, and we should be willing to exploit that as we fill them out for Sunday's race. Welcome on into the Heat Check Fantasy Podcast, powered by numberFire. That's right here on the FanDuel Podcast Network and numberFire.com. My name is Jim Sonis. I am a senior writer and analyst for numberFire, here to break down the Quaker State 400 in Kentucky from a DFS perspective. Lock for that one is set for 2:30 p.m. Eastern on Sunday, so a little bit earlier lock than we've had recently. The Indy race was at like 4 o'clock, and I think Pocono was around then too. So earlier lock, make sure you are aware of that. But the good thing is you can fill out lineups literally right now. We have all the information we are going to have through Sunday available right now. So feel free to fill out lineups while you listen along here, because we can do that right now. That is one of the luxuries of this COVID-19 schedule. Having the starting order set on Wednesday or Thursday, definitely a major advantage for us as DFS players. Before we take a look at the track breakdown here for Kentucky, quick reminder to subscribe to the numberFire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed, because we got a lot of good stuff going on there right now. We have PGA podcasts with myself and Brandon Gadula going up every week. We also have a UFC podcast this week with Austin Swaim breaking down UFC 251 at Fight Island. You can find that right now on the numberFire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed. Next week, I am kind of out, but we'll still have 2 NASCAR podcasts pre-recorded and set and ready to discuss strategies for Bristol at the All-Star race and for the Kansas race following that. Actually, I think it's Texas. But regardless, those will be up next week. So make sure you are subscribed to get those as they come. Go check out the UFC podcast right now as well. Speaking of UFC, the next UFC event is on Fight Island, and FanDuel is celebrating the highly anticipated action with one of its biggest MMA contests yet. For just $8.88, enter FanDuel's $200,000 Saturday UFC Super Octagon and compete for your share of the $20,000 prize pool, including a $50,000 first place prize. Take your pick of Kamaru Usman, Amanda Kibas, Leonardo Santos, and so many more, and follow along using FanDuel's live scoring as the fights unfold. Someone is going to take down a share of $50,000 on Saturday. It might just be you. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Let's take a look at the track breakdown here for Kentucky, and as mentioned, we can finally go back to targeting drivers based on their speed rather than where they're starting for this race. The race is 267 laps long, which is up about 100 laps from where we've been over the past 4 races, and in shorter races, we need to sell our souls for place differential. Here, there are enough laps to be led where we can get upside from drivers starting near the front by leading laps. But even there, we do have freedom in where we get those drivers who could lead laps. In 15 races at 1.5 mile tracks using this exact same package, 6 drivers have led at least 40% of the laps. 3 of those 6 drivers started 9th or lower. 15 drivers have led at least 30% of the laps. 7 of them, so about half in both samples, started 8th or lower. So it does help to start up front. Starting up front is not a bad thing. Pole sitters tend to lead a good number of laps, but it is not a prerequisite to start up front to lead laps. So even if you love a driver who drew like 11th, hypothetically, where Denny Hamlin drew, I believe, that can still be okay. That driver can still lead laps despite that. You can still feel really good about that driver. And that's especially true with how the starting order was set, because again, top 12 cars and owner points, starting in the top 12 spots of the race. They drew randomly to set the order of those 12. And this will be the 3rd time they've had a race like that, where the starting order was set this way, at a 1.5 mile track. In the first 2 races, we've seen 4 drivers lead at least 20% of the laps, and those 4 drivers started the race in 1st, 9th, 11th, and 11th. So whether they were in the front half of the top 12 or the bottom half, it didn't really matter. As long as they were fast, they could still lead laps. The one thing they did have in common, though, those 4 drivers to lead at least 20% of the laps, is that they all came from those top 12 starting positions. They were in the top 12 in owner points. This makes sense because those are the 12 best cars so far this season. So clearly they're the ones most likely to run out front and get you upside via leading laps. If you look at the perfect lineups in those 2 races like this one, both of them had at least 2 drivers starting inside the top 12 make the perfect lineup. So that's how I'm going to start my lineups for this week. I will likely have 2 drivers in the top 12 in most of my lineups for sure, and then I'll look for place differential from there. The reason for that comes from the perfect lineup. In looking for the place differential after I get those 2 drivers inside the top 12. Both of those perfect lineups had 1 driver starting outside the top 30 who made it. It was Cole Custer once and Christopher Bell once, and those cars have speed. Some of the cars outside the top 24 in owner points, but they haven't had the consistency to be in the top 24 in owner points. So if you see a driver, we'll talk about a couple, starting outside the top 24 who has had speed on this track type, you should feel good about them. And as mentioned, there will be at least 2 we'll discuss later on in this podcast today. The same thing goes for drivers who draw towards the bottom end of the range from 13th to 24th. Those cars could be as high as 13th in owner points. They're good, they're fast, but again, they just haven't been as consistent as those top 12 drivers. They can easily pop off a top 10 run in an individual race. And if you get that out of a driver starting in the middle of the pack, they're probably going to wind up within the perfect lineup on FanDuel. So for value plays, I do still value place differential. It's just not as big of an emphasis as it was for the races in Pocono, Indianapolis, and Talladega. I will give a bump up to drivers who drew towards the bottom end of their tier, and we'll talk about several of those drivers throughout the podcast for today, but as long as I expect that driver to be fast, they can be in play pretty much no matter where they start from a value play perspective. Now, the way to determine who will be fast is looking at past races at 1.5 mile tracks. This is the 6th race at a 1.5 mile track so far this year. 2 of those in Las Vegas and Homestead also had lower banking like Kentucky. So I'd put the heaviest emphasis on races in Las Vegas and Homestead when you're trying to decide who will be fast on Sunday. But Atlanta and the 2 Charlotte races can also let us know what we should expect because they're the same length, different bankings, so not the same thing, and that's why I want to value Vegas and Homestead more, but it can definitely give us a signal, too, to look at Atlanta and Charlotte, and this is true for both the studs and the value plays. Looking at what the studs have done can tell you who in the top 12 has the upside to lead laps and win. Looking at the value plays tells you who has the ability to snag some place differential points and finish better than where they're starting. So to recap here, we've got freedom in the starting position of our studs. They can start first, they can start 12th. Doesn't matter too much. As long as they are fast, they can lead laps and win this race. I would give a bump up to value drivers starting at the bottom end of their tier, whether it be 13th to 24th or between 25th and 36th. Give them a bump up because place differential does matter, and we can target them starting higher in the order if you think they can get a top 10 finish. Didn't wind up being that way for a lot of the value guys for this week. A lot of the value guys did draw towards the bottom of their tier, and we'll talk about them in the tier-by-tier breakdown. So, but if you love Ricky Stenhouse Jr. or Chris Buescher starting in 14th and 13th, then you can definitely justify them as long as you think they can get a top 10. And finally, lean on Las Vegas and Homestead most heavily when trying to decide who will be fast on Sunday. Sprinkle in some thoughts based on Atlanta and Charlotte as well. That wraps up the track breakdown here for Kentucky. So let's dive into the tier-by-tier breakdown based on the salaries over at FanDuel, starting off with the elite tier. That is Kevin Harvick at $14,500 through Martin Truex Jr. at $12,300. And if you look at this tier based on my model, it's kind of Kevin Harvick in a tier of his own, Denny Hamlin in a tier of his own, and they're the top 2 guys. And that makes complete sense and is likely how things should be with how well those 2 drivers have run this year. They're probably going to be the 2 I like the most straight up once again, and I will try to pair them together when I can at times, just because I think that the upside in them is really big. But I want to take a second here to discuss Kyle Busch at $13,000 because as we discussed in the podcast, I've been pretty off Busch for a while now. I've written 17 betting guides for numberFire so far this year, and Busch has been in only 2 of them. One of them was for the Busch Clash, which was an exhibition race in Daytona, doesn't count. The second time that Busch was in my betting guide is today for the Kentucky race. And there are a couple of reasons for that. And the first one is that he's on the pole, which definitely increases his laps led projection, increases his upside. But second, he had some decent runs in the more recent races at the 1.5 mile tracks. He had a 4th place average running position in Atlanta. He finished 2nd in that race. He was also 4th in the first Charlotte race. And Busch has had a top 5 average running position in 7 of his 9 career races in Kentucky, and he's won twice. So I've been off Kyle Busch for a while. It dates back to before the start of the 2020 season. Even during the playoffs last year, he wasn't that good. He's had 1 win in the past calendar year, and that's wild for Kyle Busch. But I think this is finally a time to buy into the bounce back. I will have some in DFS for sure, and I think that he's an interesting win bet. He's 7-1 at FanDuel Sportsbook. I've been off him all year, but I think to me, this is the spot where I want to attack Kyle Busch and go at him once again at $13,000 on FanDuel. Chase Elliott and Martin Truex Jr. are in this tier as well. Truex is awesome at this track. He's won twice in the past 3 years. Elliott has been crazy fast on this track type too, so I am okay with everybody in this tier. But if I'm ranking them for DFS, I'm going to go Harvick 1, Hamlin 2, Kyle Busch 3, Chase Elliott 4, and Martin Truex Jr. 5. I like all of them, but if I had to rank them, I think that's the order in which I go. Again, Harvick, kind of a tier of his own, Hamlin the same thing, followed by Busch in that 3rd tier. Moving to the 2nd tier on FanDuel, that is Joey Logano at 11.7 through Clint Bowyer at 10.2. And this is a really solid tier because I think several drivers in this tier have a shot to win the race. But there are 2 drivers starting outside the top 12 we should discuss briefly. Those 2 guys are Eric Jones and Clint Bowyer, and they're both really good at this track. Jones is starting 16th. His finishes here in the Cup Series are 6th, 7th, 3rd, and 3rd, respectively. Bowyer starting 15th, so 1 spot ahead of Jones, and he's $10,200. Bowyer had an awesome car here last year. He had a 9th place average running position in the year before that, so the 2 are kind of spendy, and they might rob you of another potential dominator, and that's definitely a negative, so they're going to be more secondary type plays for me. They're not going to be core plays because I don't expect either to win, and I want to make sure I'm getting exposure to drivers I think can lead laps. Not sure Jones and Bowyer will do that, but I want to make sure I get enough of these 2 guys where I can benefit if they go off. So definitely keeping a close eye on Clint Bowyer and Eric Jones and wanting to get enough, but I don't want it to rob me of another driver who could potentially lead laps within those top 12. As for the others in this tier, my favorite, shockingly, is Ryan Blaney, yet again, at $11,000. Blaney had a 4th place average running position at this track 2 years ago, but more importantly, he has 4 top 5s in 5 races at 1.5 mile tracks this year. In the race where he did not get a top 5 finish, he was leading with a couple of laps left and got burned by a late caution. He pitted, finished 11th, wasn't good, but he was leading that race later on. Blaney has contended at all 5 races at tracks like this so far this year. He led 70 laps in Homestead, which is a really good indicator of what to expect for this weekend. One thing that can help you get to guys like Bowyer and Jones is using Blaney as your second stud. Because he's only $11,000, you could pair Blaney with Harvick, Hamlin, or Busch, and that should allow you to get back up to Bowyer and Jones with that 3rd slot. And that's a build I will try to use at times this weekend. That's the one situation where I think I can get up to Jones and Bowyer without punting for my final spot. So I'm going to try to do that this weekend. So among the potential dominators, Blaney is first for me. I'll go Logano second, Keselowski third, and among the potential place differential guys, I would go Jones above Bowyer due to how I view the upside within those 2 drivers. Moving to the mid-range, that is Alex Bowman at $10,000, through Matt DiBenedetto at $8,600, and this tier has a lot of guys starting in the top 7 slots, and that's tough for guys who are not elite plays. I don't mind Bowman as a potential contrarian play with how fast he has been on the 1.5 mile tracks this year. Interesting win bet too. And only Kevin Harvick has led more laps on the 1.5 mile tracks than Bowman so far this year. But I think Bowman's a better bet than he is a DFS play. One guy in this middle tier is starting in the back of the pack. That guy is Christopher Bell, all the way back in 34th, and he is going to be a core play yet again. If you've been listening to this podcast the past couple of weeks, you know we've used Bell a lot. We're going to do it again, once again here. FanDuel has been upping the salary on Bell because he keeps starting so far back. But even at $9,000, I still think he is very worthy of that salary because Bell has been hot recently. He's had good runs. He finished 12th in Indy despite a late pit stop. He was running higher than that for most of the race. Finished 4th in the first Pocono race. And those are not similar to this track, but Bell also has a pair of top 10 finishes at the 1.5 mile tracks since the end of the COVID-19 layoff. And if you can get a top 10 finish out of a driver starting 34th, I don't really care that much about the salary. Yeah, $9,000 is a lot for a guy with win odds as long as Christopher Bell's, but he's going to be a top-notch DFS play if he gets another top 10 finish, and I think that's very much within his range of outcomes again on Sunday. So that's what we have with Bell here. He will be a lock for me in cash games, probably the first driver I put in my lineup, and he's going to be a core play for tournaments too. That place differential upside is just way too good on him for me to pass it up. Bowman is starting up front, but we have two of his Hendrick Motorsports teammates starting in the middle of the pack. Those guys are Jimmie Johnson in 20th and William Byron in 21st. I love both of those drivers. Elliott has been arguably the best car on 1.5 mile tracks so far this year. So you know this team has speed, which should make us like both Johnson and Byron as well. Now Johnson coming off the first missed race he's had in basically 2 decades due to COVID-19. That pushed him outside the top 12 no-owner points, but it puts him in a position to rack up place differential points, which is tremendous from a DFS perspective. As for Byron, his finishes at the 1.5 mile tracks have been pretty bad, and that's because he is a volatile driver. He is very young, and you expect young drivers to have upside, but also have a whole lot of downside, and Byron has very much had that. But the speed for Byron has been great, and that means we can't expect him to push for a top 10 finish. So I like both these guys a lot, both Johnson and Byron, and I'm going to have both of them in the same lineup pretty often. I think they stack well with Chase Elliott. If you just want to go all in on Hendrick Motorsports, I will have that lineup plenty as well. But if I had to pick between the two, I'd favor Johnson because the consistency is higher, and both those guys sit behind Bell, but I am really in on all three of these drivers in the middle tier: Christopher Bell, Jimmie Johnson, William Byron. Regardless of format, they are all three really good plays for DFS on Sunday. Moving down to the value tier on FanDuel, that is Matt Kenseth at $8,200 through Austin Dillon at $7,200. And this is another tier where one driver is starting further back. And that guy is Cole Custer, who is $7,700 and starting 29th. Custer actually won here in the Xfinity Series last year, and he's shown a lot more life recently. The downside here is that he hasn't shown that same life on the 1.5 mile tracks. His best finish there is 12th, and that's his only finish better than 18th. So if we're talking about which of these drivers starting further back I am more willing to fade, it would be Cole Custer. I'd rather fade him than Bell, but I do think that Custer is a good play and should probably be atop this tier. He will not be atop this tier, though. The one thing that prevents me from putting Cole Custer at the top of my list within this value tier is that both Tyler Reddick and Austin Dillon are in this range, and they have been crazy fast on these tracks this year. Reddick is starting 24th. That's just 5 spots ahead of Custer. So the place differential, the equation, not that different there. Austin Dillon is up in 19th, and Reddick had a 4th place finish in Homestead. As you know, he was 8th in the first Charlotte race, but Dillon has actually had 3 top 5s in 5 races on this track type for the season, and he's a full $800 cheaper than Reddick. Dillon has not been as good at this specific track, but he is the 13th overall driver in the current form section of my model, which is the highest of anybody in this tier by 5 whole spots. He's clear of everyone by 5 spots. The guy second on that list is Reddick, up in 18th. So that's enough for me to put Dillon as my highest ranked driver for DFS in this tier, ahead of Custer, ahead of Reddick. I'll put Reddick second and Custer third. Ryan Newman starting 23rd is worth a look too, but he'd be 4th on my list. I just love the speed that RCR has had this year. That puts me very much in on Austin Dillon and Tyler Reddick for Sunday's race. The punting tier, it's not so hot. It's Chris Buescher at $7,000 on down. This has Chris Buescher and Ricky Stenhouse Jr., and they're fine, but they're starting 13th and 14th. So nobody in this tier really stands out to me as being an elite play for DFS. I'm going to try to make Austin Dillon my salary floor in cash games if I can, and I can. I filled out a lineup before. You can make that work, and I don't want to dig down here in tournaments all that often. John Hunter Nemechek, Michael McDowell, Ryan Preece, they're all at least in play. Of the three, I'd probably go McDowell just because he's starting 30th. He finished 15th in Homestead. I would not expect the same speed he's had the past 2 weeks to carry over, but, he's in play. I think there are also worse ideas than using Ricky Stenhouse Jr. as a sprinkle play in tournaments. He's starting 14th. He has 2 top 5s at 1.5 mile tracks so far this year, and he could do that again. And if he does, he will obviously pay off at $6,500. I just want more wiggle room in where my drivers are starting, and the starting spot for Stenhouse does not give me that. So sprinkles of Stenhouse in tournaments, but in general, I want to live above this tier when possible, trying to get to guys like Newman, like Austin Dillon, and building from there. So punting tier, you got Nemechek, McDowell, Preece, maybe some of the Stenhouse, but to me, it's all about that tier above them when I can be there. Let's finish up here with my picks to win for this week. One above $10,000 and one below $10,000. I am going to stick with Kyle Busch. I don't think I picked him at all so far this year for this segment, but starting first, he's shown more speed recently at the 1.5 mile tracks. He was good in Indianapolis as well, but the second Pocono race, got wrecked there. I think we could see a turnaround eventually, and I think that the salary coming down, the win odds lengthening, it's enough for me to buy back in on Kyle Busch. So I'm going to go Kyle Busch as my win pick for Kentucky. For the guy below $10,000, we didn't talk about him in the tier-by-tier breakdown because he's starting 10th, but I kind of dig Matt DiBenedetto again. He was really fast in Las Vegas, finished second in that race. He's $8,600. He was really good the past 2 weeks. He's had a top 10 average running position in 3 of the past 6 races, something he had done 3 times his entire career before that point. So I'm going to go Kyle Busch and Matt DiBenedetto as my picks to win for Kentucky's Quaker State 400. That is all that we have for today. Once again, I will have podcasts out for the All-Star race on Wednesday and for the race the following Sunday. They probably won't have a lot of discussion of drivers, so I'm not sure if I'll be able to record them after starting order has been set because I'm out most of next week, but I'll still have at least something up there so we can talk some strategy and general outlines and roster construction for those 2 events. So make sure you subscribe to the numberFire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed to get those right when they go up. Make sure you check out our UFC 251 podcast about Fight Island with Austin Swaim if you want a betting angle on that. We talked with Megan Nunez on covering the spread as well. So lots of good stuff here on the FanDuel Podcast Network. If you have any questions for me, I am at Jim Sannes, JimSannes. You can also follow the FanDuel Podcast Network at FanDuel Podcast. Big thank you to Calvin Theobald, our video producer, running the video side of things here today. Thank you, Cal, as always, and thank you to everyone for tuning in both today and always here for the Heat Check Fantasy Podcast. Hopefully things can go well for you in Sunday's race. We'll talk to you again next week. This has been the Heat Check Fantasy Podcast powered by numberFire.